Hi there! This video is going to cover some of the main mistakes that I see people make with bead crochet and how to fix those problems. And bead crochet looks kind of complicated, especially when you see a finished piece and you don't know how the person got there, but there's actually not too many ways to make a mistake as you're going. I like to separate it into 3 categories, and I'm going to use these test pieces that I've made to show all these different mistakes that I see people commonly make. So let's do a quick overview first. This first category comes from just having the wrong tension. So you can see half of this piece is pretty loose, and that's just because I wasn't crocheting tight enough when I started it. The next category happens when you string up your beads incorrectly, either by adding extra beads or not adding enough beads as you're stringing up the pattern. And the last category happens from not having the correct number of stitches as you're crocheting. Now, there is one final category that I didn't really show, and it's just using different brands of beads. And this isn't necessarily a problem, but different brands have different dimensions, and so your pattern might turn out a little bit different than you expected because the beads are just different shapes. So if I was using a different brand, this might end up being wider or shorter or taller, and it just happens because of the different bead shapes. So I didn't really show that just because it's not necessarily a problem, but if it's something that you're noticing, it may just be that you're using a different brand of beads than I am. I'm going to start out by talking about tension. So for all of the examples, I'm going to have this pink test swatch, and this is my correctly made piece. I tried to keep my tension uniform throughout. I had the right number of beads and the right number of stitches throughout, so this is what it should look like. And this is my test piece where I used poor tension on the bottom part. You can see that this is what it looks like when your tension is too loose. You'll see lots of gappiness through the beads, especially if you're using dark beads. Since it contrasts so much with this white thread, you'll see the thread shining through. You'll also notice that it's just a lot bigger than it should be. If this was meant to be a chapstick holder, it wouldn't hold a chapstick very well just because it's too big and it's too loose. The pattern intended for it to be nice and tight like this. So if you're noticing that your tension is too loose, there's one main thing that I recommend that everyone does. So let me pull out this piece that I've been working on and talk to you about it a little bit. So this thread that we're using is a lot thinner than a lot of people are used to when they're doing crochet. Most of the time you're using much bigger thread, and so I think when you're tensioning that, you can wrap it around your pinky once, and it normally gives you enough friction and tension that you can crochet with just one wrap around your pinky. But I've noticed that wrapping it around twice or even maybe 3 times can help hold your tension a little bit tighter with such thin thread. And for most people, just switching to wrapping it around your pinky more times to hold the tension makes all the difference. And it is a little bit different than normal crochet because you want to keep it pretty tight as you're going. I think with normal crochet, you're a little bit looser so that you can get your hook into your stitches better and everything, but with this you want to keep it nice and tight because the beads kind of hold the stitches open as much as they need to be and make it so that you can still get your hook in there. So really, don't be afraid to go pretty tight with it as long as you're not straining your hand too much or making it so tight that it's hard to get your hook in. You're not doing it too tight. I think a lot of people run into issues with tension when it comes to the very first few rows of their project. It can be easy to tighten up your tension as you go further on, but it's so hard to get tight enough tension in this first row, but not so tight that you can't get your crochet hook into your stitches. So let me show you the method that I used to start on my chapstick holders, and hopefully this will help you kind of get a better balance for your tension and make it a little bit easier. I crochet around this tail that I have rather than just doing a normal chain. So let me show you what that looks like. I go from underneath and I pull my working thread through, and then I grab my working thread and finish off that stitch. And then I just keep doing that for the rest of my initial chain. It can be a little bit tricky, especially on the first few stitches, because you don't have as much to grab. A lot of times when I'm doing a chapstick holder, I have a loop that I've attached, so I just have a little bit more to work with before I get to this step, but you can do this from the very beginning and it'll work out eventually, especially once you get past those first few stitches. Once I get a little bit further in, I'll show you how you can adjust the length of this so that it can be smaller or larger depending on what you need to get that proper tension once you start adding beads. Okay, so at this point I've done a pretty long foundation row and you can see all my stitches here. Now let's say I needed this to be a little bit wider because I'm using pretty big beads and they're just not going to fit in here very well. All I have to do is hold on to this end that I have and then run my fingers across and you'll see it starts to stretch out and over this tail that we've been crocheting around. So you can stretch it out quite a bit. And now I see it's kind of a lot longer than when I started. And this works in the opposite direction as well. If I hold on to the end of my tail and then just run my fingers over the crocheted part, we can see it start to bunch up. And you can get it to be pretty tight and small. And obviously it's kind of curling around itself right now, but as you start to crochet into this, it'll straighten out a little bit better, and it's really nice because it's adjustable. So if you need it to be tighter or looser, you can always pull it in one direction or the other to get it the exact correct distance once you start adding your beads on. Once you've finished crocheting your foundation row, you'll still need to connect it together like normal. Once I finish connecting it together, I keep crocheting around this tail for a little bit longer just to keep it nice and securely tucked in. So I go maybe halfway around the piece. So I crochet all the way around for the first row, and then I keep crocheting around my tail for another 10 or 15 stitches just to keep the tail securely in. And I leave the tail long until I've finished crocheting the first few rows of beads, because during that process I can tighten it or loosen it if I need so that it's the correct length, so I can keep all of my beads nice and tight together. So that's a great way to start your project and keep your tension tight from the very beginning, but still keep your stitches pretty easy to get your hook into. So you can see, even if I pull this as tight as it can possibly get, my stitches are still as wide as they were before. They might be a little bit more bunched up than normal, but it's still pretty easy to get my hook into them. So this is a good tip for starting out your projects and keeping your tension tight from the very beginning. One last thing I want to mention is that the only difference between these two sides on this test piece was my tension. I didn't change my hook size or my thread size at all. I just kept it the same and crocheted a lot tighter on this side and a lot looser on this side. A lot of people are tempted to go and find a smaller crochet hook or smaller thread to fix the problem, but if your tension is loose, that's not going to make much of a difference. So before you go out and find a smaller hook or smaller thread, make sure that you're trying to tighten up your tension first and see if that makes a difference. Sometimes you are using too big of a hook or too big of thread, especially with such small hooks and small thread. It's not as regulated all the time, so I've had the hooks that are supposedly the same size, but sometimes they're a lot bigger or smaller than they should be. So just be aware of that. It might be an issue with your hook, but for the most part, it's an issue with tension. So start with fixing that, and then if that really doesn't work, try new thread or a new hook. Okay, next I'm going to talk about these pieces. So these are the ones where I've either missed beads or added extra beads while I was stringing them up. And again, this is my sample piece that is done correctly. So this green one is missing some beads in a couple places. And you can see this line that goes all the way around is right after I've missed some beads. So if I kind of follow the line around, eventually I'll see, oh, there's only one green bead here when there should have been two. And then everything after that point was off by a bead. On the blue one, I've added an extra bead, and again, if I kind of follow this line around, eventually I'll see right here, I have 3 black beads when I should have only had 2. And again, after that point, it's jogged over and messed up. So you can see that adding an extra bead jogs the pattern to the left, and taking away a bead jogs the pattern to the right. So you can see this line is over to the right by 1, and then this line goes over to the left by 1. So if your pattern looks normal throughout, and then it just has this line, and then it goes back to being normal, you know that you've just kind of misstrung your bead somewhere. Compared to these ones, where the pattern starts normal and then it gets messed up and it just stays messed up the whole time. This is like an example of having incorrect stitches, but if it looks mostly correct and there's just a few mistakes here and there, then you know that you've missed beads. And there is another slight variation on this. So if you're crocheting and you're about to crochet into a stitch and you grab 2 beads instead of just 1, and crochet those 2 beads into the same stitch, you'll also notice a very, very similar pattern happening. Effectively, you've just lost one of those beads, and so you'll have a mistake in this whole next round. Everything will be off by a stitch, and after that, it'll go back to looking like normal. So if you've noticed this kind of behavior in your pattern where it's just messed up on one row and then it goes back to normal and you want to fix it, it's a pretty simple deal to fix. You'll have to unravel your pattern until you reach the point where it's messed up. So if I was trying to fix this mistake and I was at this point in the pattern, I just keep unraveling until I reached a point where everything looked normal that was left. And then I would cut my thread and either add on the beads that I was missing or take out the extra beads, and I would join back on and keep crocheting like normal. And I've shown in a bunch of tutorials how to join your thread back onto your project, so if you're wondering how to do that, you can go check out some of my other tutorials, or I can just make a dedicated video if I have enough interest in that. But it's a pretty simple problem to fix if you notice it. If you get super far down and you didn't notice it as you were crocheting, you might just want to leave it as is. Sometimes it still looks cool. I think a lot of people have even mentioned this one, like even though it has some issues, it looks super cool still. So you might just want to embrace it. But if you really do want to change it, it's also not that hard to do, especially if you notice it right away. And something that I like to do as I'm crocheting is just keep an eye every once in a while and see if my pattern is looking correct, because if I do want to change those mistakes, the sooner I catch it, the easier it's going to be. So keep an eye out and pay attention, and you should be able to fix those mistakes, or just embrace it and enjoy that it's a little bit more unique. Lastly, I'm going to cover having an incorrect stitch count. So this red one is an example of having too few stitches, and you can see that the whole entire piece is slanted to the left after I skipped a stitch in this row. And this orange piece is an example of having too many stitches, and you can see it starts to slant here after I added an extra stitch. A lot of times people have their incorrect stitch count from the very beginning, so when you're doing your initial chain, maybe you didn't do enough stitches or you did too many stitches. And in that case, if you're trying to fix the problem, your best bet is to unravel it and restart with a better stitch count. Other times you can do like I did in these pieces and start with the correct number of stitches, but along the way I either skipped stitches or added extra stitches into the piece. And that's also a really similar process of fixing, where you just unravel it until you reach that point, and then you keep crocheting like normal, and you should see once you've taken out the part where you skipped a stitch or added a stitch, it should look normal. You can tell exactly where your stitches either were skipped or added, mostly based on feel, but also based on how it looks. So I start by seeing, oh, this is the row where I made my mistake, because it goes from looking like normal to looking weird. So I'm gonna feel in that area. And as I come around to where I made the mistake, I'll feel that my work is uneven in this area. And then if I look closer to confirm, I can see that my beads aren't lining up correctly. You can see here, normally your bead is kind of sandwiched in between two, but up here, these 4 beads, instead of being kind of like zigzagged in between each other, they're almost perfectly parallel, and you can see extra white gaps. So I know that this is where I skipped my first stitch. I can do the same process down below, kind of feeling around and seeing if I can tell where I skipped that stitch. And I can feel a slight difference here. And again, if I look closer, I can see that it's a little bit gappy here. And this is the area that I skipped my second stitch. It can be a little bit tricky, especially if you're not used to looking for these problems on bead crochet. It can be hard to find exactly where it is. So your alternative is to unravel until you reach a point where your pattern looks normal, and then maybe just unravel a little bit more to make sure that you definitely got that extra stitch out or that skipped stitch out, and then you can go back to crocheting like normal and it should look correct. It's a little bit easier to identify adding an extra stitch by feel, because it tends to just pop out a little bit more. So again, it's kind of hard to see on camera, but I can really feel with my fingers where these extra stitches are. So right here, this bead is bumping out more than the other ones around it, and when I run my finger over it, I can feel that difference. And then lower down, this one is actually even more prominent. And you can see that this black bead is just oriented differently than this one right next to it, and that's another trouble sign. This is where I added my other extra stitch. So again, if you're trying to fix this, you just have to unravel until you reach the point where you made your mistake, and then you can go back to crocheting like normal. You don't have to cut your string like these ones, because you have the right number of beads typically, and you've only made a mistake by adding stitches or taking stitches away. So it's not too terrible of a problem to fix. If you notice the problem and you're way down in the pattern and you don't want to unravel everything, your alternative is to add an extra stitch so that you can bring your stitch count up to the correct number, or skip a stitch so that you can take it down to the correct number. This will maybe look weird for a row afterwards, and things might not look the way you expect, but it should bring it back to the right stitch count, and the rest of your pattern should look correct. So you can try doing that if you want. You can just embrace it and enjoy that it has a fun slanted look, or you can unravel it all the way and go back again with the right stitch count. Let me show you one last time these 3 main categories, just so you can quickly identify where you went wrong in your project. This is having poor tension, so too loose, and the best thing you can do is figure out how to tighten it up, and then maybe restart your project and go again with tighter tension. This is where I skipped some beads as I was stringing up the pattern, and this is where I added extra beads as I was stringing up the pattern. If it's jogged to the right, then you've skipped. If it's jogged to the left, you've added extra. To fix it, you'll have to unravel to the point where you notice your mistake, cut your string and string up the right number of beads, and then you can connect it back onto your work and keep going, and it should look correct. Then our last category is the wrong stitch count. I have too few stitches here and too many stitches here. If it's slanting to the left, you have too few stitches. If it's slanting to the right, you have too many. And the best thing you can do here is unravel until you reach the point where you made your mistake, and then just keep going after that and make sure that you're not skipping stitches or adding extra ones on, and it should look correct. If you ever have questions about what's going wrong with your project, if you can't tell which mistake it lines up with, you can always send a message to me, and I'll do my best to help you out and help you come up with a plan on what to do to fix your project. I hope this video was helpful and that you have fun doing bead crochet. Thanks for watching.